But why don't we begin by introductions? We'll start with Ruby, and we'll go down the line. Tell us who you are, where you're from, what you're studying, and a fun fact about you. Favorite food?
Hi, my name is Ruby Coulson. I'm a junior studying Earth Systems on the Sustainable Food and Agriculture track. I grew up in rural Washington on the West Coast. If you're familiar with the Olympic National Park, that's where I live. If you're not, it's about as far west as you can get on the continental United States. I am super interested in sustainable agriculture and economically populist agriculture, and my fun fact is that I was the 46th Stanford tree, but my
Yeah!
shout out Stanford spirit. But my favorite food is I had really good ramen nagi this week. If you guys haven't been to ramen nagi, fire! It's spectacular, wonderful.
Hi everyone, I'm Cara. I'm a sophomore. I'm studying management sciences and engineering, and I was a part of the Hoover People, Politics, and Place Fellowship this past summer. And my favorite food would be fish, which worked out really, really well for me because I was stationed in a remote campus in Southeast Alaska in the Indian Islands. So I had the best fish of my life this summer, and I'm really, really missing it.
Hi, my name is Bella. I'm from a farm in Nebraska. I have a fourth generation corn, soybean, cattle, and horse farm, which is quite a lot. I would say my fun fact is I've been riding horses since I was 3, and my favorite food has to be an Omaha steak.
Awesome, sounds great. And on the panel today, we have leaders from the Stanford Rural Club, as well as fellows who did the People in Politics and Places Fellowship this past summer, who are stationed at different locations across the country, including Alaska, alongside Wisconsin. So why don't we start with the rural leaders? Can you tell us a bit about the Rural Club, how it began, the mission, and your programming for this year?
Hi, I'm Bella. Again, I'm the vice president for Rural Club this year. Rural Club started as a large effort by Tom, who's sitting over there, but also originated with somewhat of a farm student union in the early 2000s, then became the Stanford Rural Engagement Network around 2018 with the Haas Center for Public Service and the Bill Lane Center for the American West. And yeah, we're super excited for the year, and Ruby can talk a lot more about our programming.
Yeah, so I am the external events coordinator this year, which means I coordinate anything that is not occurring on Stanford's campus. But some very popular things that happen on Stanford's campus is our upcoming 3rd annual Rural Panel, which the past 2 years has been an absolutely spectacular event. With panelists from last year, we had someone from New Hampshire. It's not just Californian rural, it's not just West Coast rural. It's really representative of the entire rural America, and our panel instructor and leader works really hard for that. Outside of that, we're also doing off-site visits to Tomcat Ranch nearby. But rural America isn't just agriculture. So there's the Regenerate Conference, there's the Radically Rural Conference, which we weren't able to send anyone to this year due to some scheduling conflicts, but we've had students go in previous years. And there's also a large Society for Rangeland Management conference happening in Monterey this year that we're hoping to send some students to. And again, just plugging that rural panel. It is so much wonderful work that goes into it. It's at the O'Donohue family farm. We get an amazing charcuterie board if you haven't been, and just truly an amazing spread of speakers. And Bella and our organizer Kate are working really hard to get that going in the spring.
And I heard through the grapevine that you guys are doing line dancing.
Every other Wednesday at On Call.
Okay, and that's open to everyone?
Yeah, line dancing's open to everyone. This past week it was at the O'Donohue family farm again, which it was really stunning. But yeah, line dancing every other week on campus Wednesday nights at On Call Cafe.
Thank you. And Cara, can you tell us about a bit about the People, Places, and Politics Fellowship?
Yeah, so the People, Politics, and Place Fellowship was a pilot program that ran through Hoover this past year, and it aimed to station students with primarily urban backgrounds in rural or remote areas. I was stationed, like I said earlier, in an extremely remote area in Southeast Alaska on an island in the biggest nature preserve that we have here in the U.S. And basically every other week, we would have about 10 fellows come in on a float plane. The only way you could really access the island is by float plane, or if you're going to take a 6-hour boat ride from the nearest cities, which would be Juneau, Sitka. And the other locations for this fellowship were in Wisconsin, where Jeanette went, and she'll be here shortly. And we also had a placement out here in Pescadero in California that we're looking forward to revamping, going back towards next year. But the aim of the fellowship was to really give the sort of geographic and community context that shape civic engagement and civic life in these areas, and try and build perspectives from primarily urban students in these areas and open their minds and look at the values that cause political discourse in rural communities.
Cara, as someone who grew up in an urban, suburban environment, what were your perceptions of rural America before the fellowship? And I guess where those perceptions come from, and what made you curious enough to spend the summer in Alaska?
Yeah, I think I had a slightly different experience from most just because of how remote my experience was. A lot of my perceptions of rural America came from my hometown. I'm from Newport Beach, which is it's pretty urban and slightly right-leaning compared to most California cities. And I think I just personified politics in rural America as very homogenous because people were based off of tradition or the traditions of their families, and sort of just the continuation of just like ideology in small communities. But I had that challenged very strongly while I was in Alaska, and I kind of got to see that rather they have more conversations sometimes within these communities because you're put in such close-knit environments where you're expected to respect the people around you and hear their opinions based off of values, and you can't exactly get yourself into the same sort of like echo chambers that I was expecting. It was quite the opposite. And that I got that idea challenged even before the fellowship. We had a conversation with Nick Jacobs, the author of The Rural Voter, and he gave us the same quiz that you just did. And I remember sitting there being very, very surprised. I thought that rural communities would be a lot more religious, but in reality, the religious rates in both cities and rural communities are extremely similar. So yeah.
I guess for Bella and Ruby, being on the other side of the perception gap, coming from a rural community, what was it like seeing folks' misperceptions and misconceptions about your identities and the identities of your communities, and how did you navigate those assumptions?
Yeah, I can go first. I think the best way to answer that question is by walking through the 3 most common reactions I get when telling somebody I'm from Nebraska. The first one I usually get is something along the lines of, wow, followed by like some awkward silence. The second most common response I get is, that's so niche, followed by a question asking me if I prefer the Bay to Nebraska. But finally, which doesn't happen as often, but it's happened enough where it sticks with me, is the response, I'm sorry. And I never know what they're sorry for exactly. But for me, I think to answer your question on misconceptions, I would say the 3 misconceptions I've ran into the most stem from either fascination, some level of confusion, and sometimes that element of pity. And I think that these reactions have really forced me to reiterate and really vindicate my relationship with my hometown, how I view it, and what questions I could be asking to understand it from both their perspective and both from my perspective as a rural student.
Yeah, sorry. I really agree with that. I think that the pity that comes in is oftentimes like guiltily self-imposed. I felt like the narrative of like, oh, getting out of a rural area was really pervasive. And when I came here, I was like, yes, like I've done it. I got out. And I think it didn't take long for me to realize that like the community that had fostered me coming here is very much still a part of me. And I think like when looking at the larger misconceptions, pity is often the dominant feeling because people don't understand, because they assume that everyone that lives in rural communities is, you know, living on this desolate ranch in the middle of nowhere, and they eat just raw lettuce, and there's no internet, and it's just a monogamous culture. Like there's nothing like that. Like one of my friends visited my hometown this summer, and he was like, wow, it's beautiful, like you must be so excited to go back. And I think the best way to curb those misconceptions is like having people come into rural areas and be like, look, like we're not a monolith. Like this is a diverse group of people with diverse experiences that need to and continue to be represented at the federal level at a really accurate rate. But I think that like pity is such an accurate way to put it. Yeah, even though I come from like a really traditionally beautiful place, I still feel like I get that, wow, it must be so nice to be in the Bay. Like, sure, you think that.
Well, that gives us a natural segue to Jeanette, who's from 20 minutes down the road. As someone who's from 20 minutes down the road and a suburban area, what were your misconceptions or your conceptions or perceptions of rural students when you came into Stanford? And what made you curious enough to go to Wisconsin and spend a summer there?
Hi, I'm Jeanette. I am a senior studying political science. Sorry, I just came from a different panel, but very excited to be here. And yes, I'm from Mountain View, which is very much, it's like 5 miles away. I could bike there. So I think coming into Stanford, I hadn't had much kind of exposure or maybe even like given much thought to what rural life is like. I think coming from somewhere so close and it's suburban, maybe I go into the city and think, oh, this is different. But I think in the other direction, not so much. But I think that as I was at Stanford and I was learning more about political science, and I talked more with my grandpa, he's a farmer from like rural Taiwan. I think that I felt like as we were having this conversation about who the average American is, or just who like the average person is, that I felt like maybe I didn't really, there was a big part that was missing. And so I wanted to get involved in that conversation. I was in DC earlier this year working on, at the federal level on like broadband issues, and one of the things that really came up was rural broadband. And I realized I don't know anything about this. I'm from Silicon Valley, like we have broadband. And so I wanted to apply for this fellowship and just really understand the issues that I had been working on, but maybe from a way that, or from an angle that wasn't really representing, or I felt like I didn't really know like what it is that the people needed.
And now this question is for everyone, including folks from the Rural Club. What was the most memorable part of your summer experience this past summer? I guess for you will be going back home, now having been at Stanford, and for obviously folks at the fellowship, the most memorable part of your experience in the rural communities, and the most challenging part.
I can start. This summer, I actually worked with the Bill Lane Center in rural southern Colorado at Red Wing Ranch, and I was on a cattle ranch with about 400 to 600 head at any given point. It was hard. It was 4,000 acres. It was somewhere I'd never been before, and it was 5 people. And I came from a rural area, but to be in such a geographically isolated area as well was very different. And I think the biggest thing I took away from it was that when you're working with a team of 5 people in a small area, there's no room for miscommunication. There's no room for misunderstanding. And obviously, I think that can scale really well. But the communication skills you get when working in really close-knit communities where, like, if you have like water issues, right, big issue with the American West, your neighbors are impacted by that, right? If you accidentally overdraw water, your neighbors are going to be upset about that for good reason. That's their lifeline. And you have no right to be selfish, and to be selfish is to take a stab at your own community. So I think looking at like an agricultural point of view from rural America, like that was really big. There's no place for selfishness. It is an extremely community-driven culture, and if you need something, like these are the people who are going to be there for you. And I think that was just like if you ran out of a shovel or you needed tables for an event, like you go to your neighbor and ask for that. And they didn't really want to say no because they knew that at some point in the future they would want to ask for help for you as well. And I think that could really be translated into a larger American culture, but rural America does that really well, I think.
Yeah, not to echo exactly what Ruby said, but I had a very, very similar experience within Alaska. 8 people, our groceries are coming in maybe every 3 weeks, extremely weather dependent on the most unpredictable weather in Southeast Alaska. So for us, it was just relying on each other so intensely and this idea of intergenerational community as well. I spent half my day with the two Homestead parents, 2 and 5-year-old children, and then in the evening I was holding conversations with both the Homestead parents. And I think that's very different than the experience that I get here at Stanford, where I'm around a lot of peers my age and a lot of very similar life positions, not a 5-year-old who's only ever known her island in Southeast Alaska. And forming such deep bonds with those people gave me a confidence to kind of experience such like great adventure that I wouldn't usually have the confidence to do. Like one of the most lasting days was we circumnavigated the island on our sea kayaks, and it was 11 miles. It was 8 hours. We went pretty slow. But in Southeast, it's not very easy to tell the tides. There's no one else out there. In the Indian Islands where I was at, we're the only populated island there, so it's not like we had neighbors. If we got stuck during our circumnavigation, we could just pop over to an island and stay at someone's house. We had to keep going. I actually fell in the 45-degree water halfway through and just got to keep paddling. And it was experiences like that that really, really stuck with me throughout the fellowship, and I really appreciated. And I would say on the other end of that, the greatest challenge was the remoteness and I guess like the extreme experiences of weather. And we ran on a remote microgrid. The whole island didn't use anything for no fossil fuels besides our fuel for the boats. So we're just dependent on how much hydro do we get in, how much solar are we getting in. The weather really affected what we're able to cook. If we can't run the ovens because we don't have enough energy because it's been foggy for the past few days, we're having a cold dinner. We're eating protein bars from the back of the fridge, and it was extremely bonding to do those things. It was awesome, but there were certainly days where it was 45 degrees in the yurt, and I was missing my heated home.
For me this summer, I spent most of my time working on a Senate campaign in Nebraska, half of my time in DC, half of it organizing in Nebraska. I think to address one moment specifically, this summer, I got an email from my boss and all of the other interns in Nebraska, I was in Nebraska at the time, were given assignments to go knock on doors. And my boss is like, Bella, you're at Stanford, you can be doing other stuff other than knocking on doors for rural Nebraskans. And I said respectfully to my boss, I really want to do this. Just because I go to a place like Stanford doesn't mean I'm stuck up. I know my way around a farm. I can sure remember how to knock on a door. And I think that moment in particular really solidified for me the difference in perceptions just because of where I go to school. I think if I would have stayed in college in Nebraska, I wouldn't have had that conversation, and that wouldn't have been a topic brought up by my boss. And I think it speaks a lot to the perceptions of what a Stanford student is and what it means to not only be a rural student in Stanford, but then to go back home and be a Stanford student in a rural place.
Yeah, I think what stuck out to me the most is kind of similar to what Ruby was saying, but maybe in 2 parts. I think, first of all, like, I am so from the suburbs. And one of the things that we did when we were there in rural Wisconsin was we helped, like, move the fence for where the sheep were, like, grazing. And I think that was, like, one of the first days, and I think what I was really surprised, or I guess I don't know what I had thought before, maybe I just hadn't thought about it, which I think also stuck out to me, is that like you're moving this fence like every 2 days. And it's a really like big fence and it's kind of flimsy and it gets tangled really easily. And I think I was just really impressed by how the pacing in which things get done, and how consistent that is. But I think one other thing that really stuck out to me is that like when we were in this town, it was like 4,000 people. Every like other day there was a community celebration. And here I kind of know my neighbors, like we went to elementary school together, but I don't really know them. And so I was like, we're celebrating our community like every day. But I think that as I went to more of these community celebrations, just talk to people, it was such a core part of what it meant to live in the town and to be part of the community was just showing up for each other. And someone else said this in a really beautiful way, but to show up for each other and like you don't need to like show up whole. You can like bring like half a pack of hot dogs, but like you showed up, and I think that was really stuck out to me as something that was really cool, and kind of different from my home here.
So one of the goals of the PPP fellowship is understanding how the physical space shapes politics. And it sounds like you all found significance in the physical spaces that you were in. Could you kind of articulate what is it about that physical space that shaped the politics of the people who are in those spaces?
Yeah, I think kind of touched on earlier, a lot of what I saw about rural politics was based in local industries. So there's a very small town close to the island called Elfin Cove. I think it has around 10-year-long residents. But so many of the political opinions there were based off of the regulation of the trawling industry, the regulation of commercial fishing, of people who are visiting Alaska like myself, who wanted to get out on the water, but what am I doing with those resources? Am I using them in a time of abundance like summer, or am I pressure canning them and putting them up for the winter? And I think that it's a large misconception that at least I had, that it was more, politics felt a lot less socialized there versus they were much more rooted within the place in the preservation of resources, because these resources matter in a way that there is no cop out. There is no, if you don't put up food for the winter now and the weather is unpredictable, you won't have the resources later. And so it felt like people's political opinions were very dependent on what are the policies of the people around me, how are they preserving the industries that I'm dependent on, or the resources I'm dependent on. And yeah.
I think the area we were in Wisconsin is called the driftless area. And they have this whole thing about how, like, in the ice age, like, it didn't flatten the land, and so there was no ice drift. And so there are some hills, which I think is different from a lot of other parts of the Midwest. And I think what I found was that, well, it means that you have to do a different kind of agriculture, right? It's not like you look and there's just kind of land and like rows and rows of crops. I think there was a need to do some sort of like regenerative agriculture because there are hills. And I think to me that spoke a lot to the politics, to the people who are willing to come to a place and try something kind of new like regenerative agriculture, the people who are staying as opposed to kind of leaving and finding or buying land somewhere else. And also brought in, I think, people who are willing to think differently. And so where we were in rural Wisconsin is probably, I know we're talking about preconceptions, but probably like different from what you conceive of as who might be in rural Wisconsin. There were people of really different political beliefs, and just the town itself of just like 4,000 people is really purple. And we really, I think, experienced that when we were there talking to different people who had really different perspectives, but had lived together because they have this shared value of wanting to do this kind of agriculture.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think my first day when I arrived in Colorado, I had a talk with my boss, who's a Stanford alum, who is trained in wildlife ecology, and now she's a rancher. And she looked at me and she said, "I know you're studying environmentalism and sustainability, but you're never to say those words this summer." And I was like, "Whoa, what?" And she was like, "You will get frustrated at farmers and ranchers who agree with you but are frightened by the word sustainability, who are frightened by the connotations of this word and what that has meant for them historically." And that's because, like I mentioned, water is life. You cannot ranch without water. You cannot grow food without water. And that is so inherently political. And every single person who is working off the land knows that. And every single person there who is working in agriculture, who is working in livestock, cares about the land and is a land steward. And I think there's a lot of preconceived notions that agriculturalists just pull and pull and pull from the land and just deplete the soil and leave there nothing to be left. And to some extent that's true, but a really good, profitable rancher will not do that because the land is their wealth. They understand that if they graze the grass down, they understand if they drain all the water, they cannot run their herd the next year. They cannot plant more. And from a very economical point of view, that means they're broke. That means they file bankruptcy. And that is part of the reason why the politics is so centered around their land, is because even like tourism, right? Like a dude ranch, no one wants to go to a dude ranch that looks bad, right? If there's no water, if there's nothing there to sell to the wealthy tourists, like that's bad. So while I oftentimes found myself agreeing with the predictions that the Farmer's Almanac is saying there's going to be less rain, and last year there was 7 inches, and this year that there's 5. Like, there was an undertone of that we agree, we genuinely do agree that something is happening that is hurting your bottom line. I have my word for it, and you have your word for it. I don't care that we have different words. What matters is that we need to find a solution, and that we need to work together to find that outcome, because realistically, like, the politics is inherently rooted in that place, and those people benefit from a good place that feeds them, that fuels them, and that will continue to. And that often means, like you were saying, like a return to traditional forms of agriculture, which includes fire, which is very controversial and very scary, but it can be very profitable if used properly. But that is really frightening because of how much that place is worth to people, because of how much like social, cultural, and religious value is held in that land. And our social, cultural, and religious values are what shape politics. So I think there's no separating the politics of the land, specifically in the American West, and I'm sure it continues across the entire United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to reiterate Ruby's point. I think she clarified that beautifully. And I think adding on to that point, from my perspective in my community, I think there's also a cultural element to it. The story I like to tell, my dad's a big waterfowl hunter and he's a big deer hunter. And there's this instance, my mom is from California and she has different political beliefs than my dad. And when my dad would go out during November to go hunt a buck, she was always so confused why he would drop it off at our local meat locker. And he's like, oh, that's just what you do. And it turns out later in the years, my mom found out that meat locker actually processed the meat and sent it to homeless populations, a city an hour and a half away. And I think going off of Ruby's point of language, I think if that program was wrapped in the language that a lot of us are used to here at Stanford, it wouldn't be popular in that community. But there's a level of tradition and understanding of those practices that this is just what we do because this is our way of life. This is how we help people. I think language is a key factor in that, and not only looking at something like hunting and narrowing it down into a particular art or particular practice, but looking more holistically at the impact even just one, you could say, sport or one tradition has on a community is so, so important. And one, bridging that divide, and two, working towards a political understanding between urban and rural folk.
You've all been back at Stanford for a few months now, and it sounds like you've had so much learning over the summer. How has your learning and experience shape how you move through campus now, whether in your classes, in your conversations with friends, navigating political issues? How has your lens changed?
A couple years ago, I was vegetarian, and that was because I thought it was going to be the best outcome for the environment. And I wrote a brief blog for the Bill Lane Center this summer, and the title was "A Vegetarian Works on a Cattle Farm." And I come to Stanford, and I'm in all these classes, and I'm having these discussions with people, and I'm like, it only took me three books and a couple articles in a summer to change my mind. And they're like, that sounds like a lot of work. I don't want to read 3 books on the benefit of beef in America. And it's like, but you should. I feel often frustrated at how when students have this preconceived idea of what is best for their moral guidelines, when I come in and I'm like, hey, maybe there's a benefit to eating beef for the environment. Maybe there is a world in which we can support our rural communities and also have this socially liberal outcome you're looking at. These are not ideas at odds. I think that's something that someone who has my social background, who has my historical background, I can come into these spaces and really talk about that on a eye-to-eye perspective, and I feel really lucky to do that. And I feel really lucky to have conversations with some of my vegetarian friends who I've been able to get to go out for a steak or two and have a chit chat about the impact of why they're making their choices. And if there's a multitude of reasons why you're making a decision, that's fine. But I think at Stanford there is kind of often a a hesitance to change when that change threatens like a really deep set held belief you've had for a while, because it feels like you're admitting wrong. And Stanford students hate nothing more than being wrong. It's the fatal flaw we face all the time. So I'm excited to cause more wrongness, and I'm excited to find more wrongness in my rhetoric and language all the time.
Yeah, I think very similar kind of change in my approach of just having this openness and conversation and not being scared of I feel like I would be a lot more comfortable in a conversation that I had shared experiences, or I knew I had shared experiences with the person. And being in Alaska, like I said, with age groups, background experiences that I knew nothing about. I knew nothing about the trawling industry. I knew nothing about the regulation of fishing. And it's so scary to go into those conversations, especially if you know that party-wise you might be deferring from someone. And it's so important now that I go into my conversations looking at where do people's values come from. We talked about this before the fellowship, how different values influence different political approaches, and that helped equip me very, very well to hold these conversations where I felt like I knew very little. And now coming back to campus, it's being able to have those politically open and just ideologically open conversations with my friends, and really understanding what values or what life experiences have led them to these ideas. How can I use those experiences that maybe I've never directly had, but I can learn from through continuously interacting with them to help change my approach. And I think no one's going to be open with you unless you come to them open first.
Absolutely. And I think for me, something I've been noticing more and more, particularly in the classroom here at Stanford, is I gravitate towards storytelling about my life back home, whether it's in conversations with my friends, or whether it's actually focusing my work and my research on topics related to issues back in my hometown or back in the Midwest. I found that storytelling and being able to share my life experiences in a way that is, one, candid and almost unexpected in an academic environment helps to kind of normalize and humanize my experiences personally. I feel like if I'm able to talk about things that are issues and experiences that are important to me in a really big, prestigious place like Stanford, one, as a rural student, helps normalize for me my experience. And two, I also feel like I'm able to convey my worldview and my life experiences more accurately to professors as well as to my peers. And so I think that element of being able to share, not only share openly, but share candidly, is the most important way to navigate that experience at Stanford.
I think sharing is something that I've really tried to do since I've come back, especially as I'm talking to friends who are also from kind of suburban or urban areas who haven't had these experiences. And I think that there's so many things that like I couldn't conceptualize before I went to a rural place, that I think as I'm having conversations about policies or things of what we think we should do in my classes and just with my friends, I think I'm now a lot more kind of aware or think about also like how this could be feasible or realistic in contexts that are not like this one. And maybe I'm sure that like the place at Varoko where I was is not representative of like everywhere, right? But I think that just having this other perspective and making sure that like the solutions that we're coming up with in our conversations are not, for lack of a better word, like very kind of elitist, but can work well in different contexts. And also just like letting them know that this is something that like they can do too. And like these are places that feel really unfamiliar, but once you actually get there, like everyone's really nice. And just having these experiences as well.
Before we open up to Q&A, I have one final future or forward-facing question. What changes can Stanford make in our curriculum, our career resources, and the way we think about public service to better prepare students to serve and understand the full diversity of our rural communities?
Admit more rural students. It's too low. I mean, we saw today 15% of the US is rural. I mean, an even larger percent of the globe is considered demographically rural. Admit more rural students. Like, it's embarrassing that Stanford has such a low admit rate when, you know, the justification is like rural schools are worse, like they just can't compete. Like, then give them the resources to compete, like give them the opportunity. I think I have many peers at home and across rural America that would thrive at an institution like this that aren't given the chance. And I think Stanford should admit more rural students.
Yeah, to echo that, I think more hands-on experience and kind of the idea of a case study. You're not going to understand rural America by diving into every industry or every idea that matters across rural America. Rural America is not nearly as homogenous as you think it is. You could be in one place in Southeast Alaska, take a boat 10 minutes later, and now that community is actually dependent on oil and not fishing regulation. And giving people deep connection through case studies or through direct experience with those people will hold on so much tighter than just echoing statistics that are like, hey, rural America and cities are actually more similar than you think it is. Okay, what do I do with that? What does that equip me for? Versus genuine relationships, genuine understanding of specific areas. It may not be as broad, you may not understand all of rural America, but you'll understand the similar sentiments that come from being so connected to the land, so connected to the history of the land.
I think for me, I think it calls for a broader transformation in education of how we define success and how we define opportunities for success. I think for me, something that comes up a lot in my community or in conversations with other Stanford students is the term disadvantaged. I think there are a lot of rural communities who are disadvantaged. However, when it comes to the admissions process, I'd love to see a reframing and a distinction between disadvantage and just plain difference. I think that a lot of opportunities in rural areas are simply different, and that there's different types of success and opportunities that can come from being in a rural area that don't look like the traditional admit at Stanford. It might not look like AP classes, but for my case, it might look like the students at my school who took veterinary science, the students at my school who worked on biotechnology projects and FFA. Just redefining what does it mean to be successful, and how can we reframe what we previously conceived as just simply a disadvantaged area or an area lacking of opportunities, and seeing what opportunities they are yielding and what opportunities they're already taking, and working to understand what those are.
I think for me, having professors and mentors and role models who are from rural areas, like Tom, who made all of this happen, I think just having them share their perspective and having more kind of people to look up to who are from different places really encouraged me to explore different perspectives.
Thank you so much. All right, let's open up to audience questions. Please, gentleman in the back.
So I grew up on the Stanford campus, and 18 years ago I moved to a real small town about an hour and a half from here. And in the last 18 years, it's gone from being a population like 24,000 to being a population about 46,000, right? And the politics there are very tense. It seems like it's a fight between the rural long-term residents who rank themselves by how long their families have been in the county, right? Versus the people who are moving there. And it feels very much like the long-term residents are in a fight for the soul of their tradition and their history, right? And we hear that nationally too. During national political cycles, we hear that it's a fight for the soul of America. And I was just curious if in your experience in the rural areas that you're either from or you spent time in, if you get the sense that people there feel like they're in a fight for the soul of their tradition or their livelihood, if they're in that fight the way that it's framed.
Yeah, this was something we talked about a lot in Alaska. And I think one of the biggest solutions that was given to me as a complete outsider coming into a very, very long-standing community is, who do you put in local office? And like we said, I mean, we saw that in the quiz, the biggest form of work in these areas is local politics, local regulation. And so I think there is a certain amount of respect, or a lot of respect, that deserves to be paid to locals in an area, people who know the history of the land, know the history of the people around them. And obviously those communities are going to be opened up, and those resources will be opened up too. But for the most part, the people standing in office should be people who understand the history of the land, and are able to communicate with new people who are coming in, because you're not going to have a successful environment if it's extremely politicized or polarized in both directions. But there is something that goes to be said for who is native to the land, who has been there, who understands the experiences that have been had there, and also who is willing to listen to how can we transform this to honor that and also allow people with decently open arms.
I think from my perspective in my community, that sense of threat comes from different and competing perceptions of intent. I think if an intent can be framed in a certain way that fits that community is going to be more likely to buy into that. However, if there's a group of individuals who are coming in, kind of talking about the perceptions I talked about earlier, that sense of pity or that sense of kind of confusion about a community and looking at a community as a vehicle to solve another issue, I think that is where miscommunication and misunderstanding breeds. I think that intent matters. How you frame intent matters even more. And I think that that can be used for good and it can be used for bad in many local areas. I see that in my town. And I think that spans beyond politics and even into religion or into, like you're talking about, different populations moving into the area. Is what is your intent and what is our relationship to that intent?
Yeah, I can get real specific. So I grew up in what is the Pacific Northwest and what was historically the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe, and they are now one of the wealthiest tribes in Washington state, so much so that they are they're the only example in the United States of co-managing a natural land preserve. And that's extremely controversial in my area because I think there are three kind of subsects of rural populations when you're looking at a developing rural economy. There's natives, there's locals, and there's transplants. And a lot of people get itchy at the word transplants because I'm looking at you Californians, like we know who it is. And the reality is like that's a really hard concept, right? But the truth is when Californians come in and when wealthy like urbanites come in, they do develop the town. And it's this constant fight against development. Like that money means that we're getting better schools, we're getting better hospitals, we're getting an increase in broadband, but it comes at the risk of what? And that's I think it comes at memories, at shared culture, at this idea that this is mine. Like you're ruining what is mine. And you're coming in and you're taking your different ideals and you're ruining it. And I think that can be really it's a really difficult feeling, and it's not a new one. It's one that's happened before in the United States history, and it's not one that we have a solution for. I think it looks different now. I'm really grateful. Like in my county, the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe are our largest employer. They own our hospital. They paid for the track at my school. They are now oyster farming and they're doing a lot of tourism. And it's really controversial because they're bringing in money. And Californians are purchasing out the value of homes so that as our population goes up, so does the cost of living. And I think that's really the root of it, is this idea of like, you're taking what is mine, what my memories are, because you're pricing me out, or because you're taking what my perceived culture is. I think American culture is deeply tied to rural America, and that's, I think, a really big threat in that development is not inherently an antithetical process to a rural economy. And a lot of times rural residents don't feel like that. They feel like when they're developing, they're just gonna become, San Francisco. They're gonna become a next urban hellscape. Like they don't want that. And I think that the conversation could be had very easily where it's like, you can keep your rural lifestyle. Is it that bad if we get a couple more doctors? If our kids are in classes that aren't 40 like large? So I think it's a really difficult conversation. I struggle with myself. Development is something that happens a lot, and it comes at a feeling that is often oddly familiar for rural West communities, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for the panel. I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, which fourth largest city in the US, but surrounded by a lot of rural areas. And I think, at least in the context of federal and statewide discourse, I think a lot of people from urban areas have the perception that kind of rural voices in many ways matter more than urban voices, or that rural issues kind of are always front and center in our political landscape. And I was just wondering if maybe the reverse perception was the case in rural communities, or I guess, is there a feeling that rural issues are kind of very dominant in state and federal kind of discussions or deliberation, or is it kind of the reverse about like urban people are kind of front and center.
I think it's exactly like you said. From my experience, particularly, I think it is the reversal and seeing. I think there's historical precedents for that. I think if you look at rural electrification, and you see a lot of projects unfinished, especially in my community and near my farm, you can look at transportation, electrification, broadband. You see a lot of promises made and promises broken, and I think that it's really easy to capitalize on the emotions of that moment. And to really further drive a divide between the perceptions of like what was said before of who we are and what we need to protect, and who's trying to either help or impede or impose on what we believe is the most helpful for us.
I think that question really gets to when I was going into Wisconsin, I was really thinking about like the average American. I think as like a coastal person from Mountain View, Asian American, I think I've never thought of myself as the average American, or I guess I've been told that I'm not the average American, right? People in the American heartland are. And so I think going into the Midwest, I was like, this is the American heartland. Like I'm going to meet like people who are the average American. But I think that as I was there, I do kind of really feel this dissonance between like, we refer to this area as a heartland, come election time, we go to these areas and we're like, this is what they want and like, this is what we need to be talking about. But then after that, nothing really, right? And so I think the values between like calling someplace the heartland, but the attention that it gets outside of the few months of an election cycle, I think was really prominent to me.
Impact of like the argument that the electoral college is meant for sort of rural voters and to give rural voters a voice, and if you feel like that's really true or not.
I can take a stab at that. So I mean, I come from a very purple county. I come from a Bell County. So up until this recent election, we had accurately predicted the presidential election. I think it was for like 40 consecutive years. We were the longest lasting bellwether county. It was really sad that we lost it this year. But it was, I think it's controversial even within rural communities. I think we have the Senate for a reason. I think we have, like in my own state government, we have another bicameral, we have the Senate, we have the House. I think those exist for a reason. I also think that it's a very politically driven question, because the reality is that the Electoral College historically has favored Republicans, and as the Democrats will express, the popular vote favors them. And it feels like the rural voters are being used as a political point here to be like, oh, like we're doing this for the rural voters, we're doing this for you, when it is in that act of like monolithing rural voters. Oftentimes these counties that are showing up like on our graph is solid red or solid blue or even like dark purple. Like it's really close. Like if your county's only 80,000 people, like that split could be like 5,000 or 6,000 people. Those are your neighbors. So I think the Electoral College works in theory when you don't have a country of almost 350 million people. And it's really frustrating to me to watch it be maintained for the protection of rural voters, when if you were to spread it out, I think a lot of rural voters are more purple than we think, and it could be silencing, and it is silencing rural voters who aren't fitting into the Electoral College of that swing of that particular year, if that makes sense.
I think I have a slightly different perspective coming from Nebraska, which is a unicameral. Our electoral college is counted differently because Nebraska has to be unique. So we have 3 congressional districts. 1 electoral college vote goes to each district, then 2 go to the majority of the 3. From my perspective, at least in Nebraska, I think there's a large sense of contentment. I think everyone seems pretty content with the way it is, whether that's the way our electoral college is designed or whether it's just a lack of open discourse regarding the issue. But from my perspective, I don't have a lot to add other than what Ruby had previously mentioned.
Kind of related, but what is, like, how do you get people that, really exist in the national politics landscape to break that conception of, oh, like, why would I go as a Democrat to a rural place? And like, I don't know, I think the thing that sticks in my head is like the state of Kentucky and their, state level politics and I don't know, I feel like all of the people from Kentucky seem to, on the national level, always don't fit within the mold, but how do you get that to like, how do you change that? How do you change that sense of monolithic perception?
I think there's a couple answers. I think that's a great question. I think from my perspective, I think it needs to start with education. I think genuinely going back to what Ruby said, I think we need more rural people in places of higher education to be able to, one, advocate for issues in the room where decisions are being made. If there's not those people to advocate, how can we break those misconceptions? So I think one, it's so important that we get urban people to recognize rural life and have a better understanding of it. But we also need rural people to be able to go into urban spaces and be advocates for their cause and to be able to implement programs and discuss ideas that wouldn't have been discussed otherwise if they weren't there.
So I'm a little bit older than most people in this room, so I'm coming from a little bit more experience on some things. But I was basically the CEO of Harris County, which is the third largest county with 18,000 employees. And so that's a very urban type job and all that. A few years before I retired, I acquired a ranch that is a cow operation. I don't know where my kids go after we sell them, but I found the biggest difference between the two environments was one, at night, you can see the stars. And a lot of people in urban don't see the stars. There's a roof over their head because of the light. But the other thing is, if you live in the country, your hands get worn. And you don't have pretty fingernails and all that, although I saw yours are.
I had to cover them up.
And all that. But it's hard labor. And not only is it hard labor, but there's a lot of factors that in other businesses, you can't control those variables. The weather, the cost of a bale of hay. I went from $125 a bale to where people sold off their herds to now it's $45 a bale. And the herds are the smallest they've been since 1955. And that's why I sell my cattle at $3 plus a pound on the hoof. So it's a good business right now, but that's why the price is so big. So when y'all are talking here, I think I've learned so much more from being in the country than I ever learned urban, because when something breaks, I have to fix it. When my bull decided to go into the next field because they moved 55 fertile heifers over there, I never experienced that in Harris County. I never had an employee said, we got a bull running down the road and you're liable for it. And ultimately, he broke through the fence. Once a bull figures out that fence is a little wire, it's gone. These are not things that urban people. So I'm so excited about Stanford having a program, because you three are different people now, the ones that came from one or the other, because you see it, and you're going to be able to compete much better and understand politics. I mean, I came from a world of politics, very much so. Matter of fact, my new boss came from Stanford, who was 27 years old, who got elected and lived at home with her parents. And so it's changed dramatically, but it's about the experience. So anyway, I just appreciate this, but look up at night and see if you see the stars and get one of those internships that you can.
I have a plug if anyone's looking at doing community service in the area or wants to donate. Vita Verde in the area takes urban students, specifically in Oakland and South Bay, that would never have left their urban areas, and they do like weekend day trips. So these are like literally like typically K through 8, and they like go out and they milk goats and they collect eggs and they do stuff. It's awesome.
We are at time.
Yeah, we've got a celebrity in the room, though, that's been wanting to ask a question. Isaac is the past president of the Rural Club. Isaac, do you want to
I have a quick question. It's kind of a tough one, though. You guys spoke a little bit about elitism and your Stanford experiences. And I have friends from home in Montana who have also gone out of state and been disturbed by their experiences. And I'm just wondering if there's like a teachable moment in the classroom where, like we talk about it a little bit abstractly, but what has actually been said to you where you're like, wow, how do you think that? Maybe it's, you said vegans, whatever, but like specific things, but maybe on the converse side, has there been a different kind of experience here at Stanford too, where you're like, wait, I finally feel heard in this specific moment? I mean, I don't know, a lot of it's things we joke about, whether it's like, whether it's like college class titles, but a lot of these things do kind of alienate rural America, and so I'm wondering what times have you felt?
So many, Isaac. So many. We've had conversations about this before at Row Club. I think when it comes to just everyday conversations, I think that is where I find the most striking differences in just the way people outside of our community are talked about. I think the way we talk about people almost putting down certain populations and acting like people who are foreign to us are just so worthy of our sympathy and not really ever vindicating why we should be, upset or saddened for them. And I think that does seep into the way we instruct in the classroom. Not we, but the way professors instruct in the classroom. I think that also seeps into the way that we talk to one another as students. I think I talked about before, like the way people react when I introduce myself. I think also the way people react when I talk about stories from back home, or like what my family's up to, or like, oh yeah, my dad can't call me back right now. He's on a tractor for the next, 10 hours harvesting. And they're like, oh, you're a redneck. And I think that subtle things like that add up. It's not very subtle. I guess, yeah, not very subtle. Slightly humorous yet pointed comments add up, and I think that they really do impact what your perception of worth is at a place of higher education. So yeah, there's tons of examples, y'all.
Oh, yeah. I can be real quick. I'm a horse girl. I grew up a horse girl. I'm on the equestrian team here. I've heard every single joke there is to be had about it. So there's that aspect of it. I come back, I worked on a ranch. They're like, what was it like working in a ranch? And I was like, I was in Colorado. It's just like here. I think the big thing for me is that rural people are not dumb. We're not less educated. I'm not your affirmative action admit. Like I'm not here because my scores were less than yours or some other thing like you were mentioning earlier. The people I met this summer and the people I think of back home are traditionally book smart, are socially smart, are ecologically smart, are financially smart. I think they run laps around the average Stanford student in terms of day-to-day intelligence, and it's hard to hear that stereotype perpetrated that is rooted in a lot of really complex isms, least of which is a classism, but it's really frustrating to hear that perpetrated over and over again, and to feel subconsciously like when people hear that I've been admitted to Stanford, they're like, well, you didn't have to work as hard. Diversity, I admit. And I'm like, am I? Look at me. No. Yeah. But yeah, I think Bella's exactly correct.
And one more thing, the accent, they adopt this southern honky tonk accent when I introduce myself. That's so strange. Please stop.
Can we please give our panelists a massive round of applause?